was horse cart ride practically all the time. But once I got it, and once I knew the fella, and he was indelibly stamped, then I could leave him alone and go get him when I wanted him.
The big man's chair was empty. In May 1972, fans across America tuned into Bonanza, but something was wrong. Dan Blocker, the man everyone knew as Hoss, was gone. He wasn't just a TV star, he was like a brother to every family in the country. A simple surgery should have sent him home. Instead, it ended a legend. This is the true, sad story of Dan Blocker, his wife Dolores, and the day the music stopped at the Ponderosa. The Big Kid. The story of Dan Blocker doesn't start on a movie set. It starts in the dusty, tough terrain of DeKalb, Texas. When Dan was born in 1928, he didn't just enter the world, he made an entrance. He weighed 14 pounds at birth. To this day, he remains the largest baby ever born in Bowie County. By the time he was a young boy, he was already the size of a grown man. People stared, and kids whispered, but Dan wasn't a bully. His father, a poor grocer, taught him that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those smaller than him. As he grew, so did the legend of his strength. In school, he was the kid who could lift things no one else could touch. He was a powerhouse on the football field, a literal human wall that moved with surprising speed. But he wasn't just muscle, he was smart. While other boys were looking for trouble, Dan was looking at books. He eventually found his way to Sul Ross State Teachers College. He was a star athlete, sure, but he was also finding a love for the stage. It was a strange sight for the time. A massive, barrel-chested man who could recite poetry and move an audience to tears in a play. But life called him away from the stage and toward the battlefield. Before he was a star, he was a soldier. Dan was drafted into the army during the Korean War. He didn't ask for special treatment because of his size or his talent. He served as an infantry sergeant, leading men through some of the coldest, bloodiest terrain on Earth. He saw things in those hills that changed him. He earned a Purple Heart for his bravery, but he rarely spoke about it when he came home. He had seen the worst of humanity, and it seemed to make him even more determined to be a man of peace and kindness. When he returned to Texas, he went back to his roots. He became a school teacher. Imagine being a rowdy teenager and having a 6'4", 300-pound man walk into the classroom. You'd sit up straight. But Dan didn't lead with fear. He taught English and drama, using that booming voice to inspire kids rather than scare them. He moved his young family to California to pursue a master's degree, still working as a teacher to pay the bills. He was a family man through and through, living a quiet life far from the bright lights of Hollywood. Acting was just a side hustle at first. He took small roles in westerns because he looked the part. He could ride a horse, he could throw a punch, and he filled out a costume like nobody else. Casting directors loved him because he was a type. But they soon realized he was much more. He had a natural charm that the camera loved. He wasn't just a big guy. He had expressive eyes that showed a deep, gentle soul. He was a man of contrasts, a war hero who loved acting, a giant who taught school, and a tough Texan who wore his heart on his sleeve. He didn't know it yet, but the classroom was about to lose him to the world. He was just a teacher looking for extra work. But fate had a different plan. Finding Hoss. In the late 50s, television was obsessed with the American West. Every channel had a man in a hat, but none of them looked like Dan Blocker. When the creators of Bonanza were casting the roles of the Cartwright brothers, they knew they needed a specific kind of trio. They had the serious older brother, the handsome younger brother, and the father figure. But they were missing the heart. They needed a man who could believably crush a horseshoe with his bare hands, but would also stop to help a wounded bird. They needed Hoss. When Dan walked into the room, the search was over. He didn't just play the character, He stepped into the skin of Eric Haas Cartwright so perfectly that the line between the man and the actor vanished almost instantly. The show premiered in 1959. At first, it struggled, but once it moved to Sunday nights, it became a national phenomenon. Bonanza was the first major show filmed in color, but the real color came from the chemistry between the four leads. Dan was the glue. On set, he was the bridge between the different personalities of Lorne Greene, Michael Landon, and Pernell Roberts. While Hollywood was often a place of massive egos and sharp elbows, Dan remained the same humble schoolteacher from Texas. He showed up on time, knew his lines, and treated the crew with the same respect he gave the directors. He was the guy who would sit in the dirt and eat lunch with the grip truck drivers rather than hide in a fancy trailer. As the years rolled on, Haas became the most popular character on the show. Kids loved him because he was a big, friendly giant who felt safe. Men respected him because he was a straight shooter who didn't back down from a fight. Women adored him because of that shy, dimpled smile that suggested a heart of gold. Dan handled the fame with a quiet grace, though it wasn't always easy. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. A man of his size couldn't exactly blend into a crowd, yet he never complained. He understood that Haas belonged to the people. He leaned into the role, often visiting children's hospitals and charity events. Behind the scenes, Dan was a savvy businessman. He knew that the TV world could be fickle, so he invested his earnings wisely. He started the Bonanza steakhouse chain, turning his TV persona into a successful brand. He was building a legacy for his wife and 4 children, making sure they would be taken care of no matter what happened. But despite the money and the fame, he stayed grounded. He lived in a relatively modest home and spent his free time with his family or working on his collection of fast cars. He was a man who enjoyed the simple things: a good steak, a fast engine, and a quiet night with Dolores. The workload was grueling. For over a decade, they filmed episode after episode, season after season. The physical toll of playing a cowboy was real. There were stunts, long hours in the sun, and the constant pressure of being the anchor of a top-rated show. But Dan never slowed down. He was the ultimate pro. By the early 70s, Bonanza had been on the air for 13 years. The cast had become a real family, and the fans felt like they had grown up at the kitchen table of the ranch. No one could imagine the show without Haas. He was the mountain that didn't move. He was the strength of the Cartwright legacy. As the 1971 season wrapped up, Dan was looking forward to a break. He was only 43 years old. He was at the top of his game, wealthy, healthy, and loved by millions. He had survived the war, conquered Hollywood, and remained a good man through it all. He had every reason to believe that the best years were still ahead of him. He was planning for the future, thinking about the next season and the life he would build. The giant was at his peak, but a tiny medical fluke was about to change everything. The hospital room. In the spring of 1972, Dan Blocker felt like a man who had everything under control. He was a powerhouse of health, or so it seemed to the outside world. But even a man built like a mountain has small, hidden fractures. For a few months, Dan had been dealing with nagging discomfort in his abdomen. It wasn't the kind of pain that would stop a man who had survived the frozen trenches of Korea, but it was persistent enough to be annoying. His doctors identified the culprit, a gallbladder that needed to come out. In the world of modern medicine, even back then, a cholecystectomy was considered a routine, bread-and-butter procedure. It was the kind of surgery people scheduled on a Monday and forgot about by the following Sunday. Dan checked into Daniel Freeman Memorial Hospital in Inglewood, California, on May 11th. He was in good spirits. He joked with the nurses, his booming voice echoing through the sterile hallways, bringing a bit of the Ponderosa's warmth to the clinical setting. He told his family he'd be back on his feet in no time. There was no reason to doubt him. He was only 43. He didn't smoke or drink heavily. He was the picture of rugged American vitality. The surgery itself went exactly as planned. The surgeons removed the gallbladder without any complications, and Dan was moved to a recovery room. For a moment, it looked like this would just be a small footnote in a long, storied life. But within the human body, things can take a dark turn in total silence. As Dan lay in his hospital bed, recovering from the anesthesia, a hidden killer was forming in his veins. In the quiet hours following the operation, a blood clot developed, a pulmonary embolism. It is a terrifying, invisible complication that remains a risk even in the most successful surgeries. For Dan, the giant of a man with a heart that had carried him through war and fame, this tiny clump of blood was the one enemy he couldn't outfight. It moved through his system with lethal precision, heading straight for his lungs. On May 13, 1972, the air suddenly stopped. Dan began to struggle. The nurses and doctors rushed to his side, throwing every piece of medical technology they had at the problem. They tried to stabilize him, to force air back into those massive lungs, to get his heart to find its rhythm again. The man who had spent years portraying a character who could fix any problem with a kind word or a heavy fist was now trapped in a battle he couldn't win. In a matter of minutes, the life force that had defined a generation of television simply flickered and went out. The hospital room became a place of heavy, suffocating silence. The doctors stood back, exhausted and defeated. It made no sense to them. How could a man survive the rigors of a war zone and 13 years of grueling Hollywood production only to be taken down by a routine procedure? There was a profound sense of unfairness in the air. The gentle giant was dead. He wasn't on the dusty trails of Nevada or in the middle of a heroic standoff. He was in a cold, white room surrounded by machines that had failed him. The news had to be broken to his family first. His wife, Dolores, was waiting for the call that said he was ready to come home. Instead, she received the call that every spouse fears, the one that divides life into before and after. The shock was physical. It was as if a part of the Earth's foundation had simply vanished. There was no preparation for this. There were no long goodbyes or final letters. There was only the sudden, violent void where a husband and father used to be. Outside the hospital walls, the world was still turning. In living rooms across the country, families were watching reruns or looking forward to the next season of Bonanza. They didn't know that the heart of the show had stopped beating. They didn't know that the Ponderosa had just lost its soul. The news wouldn't hit the wires for a short while longer, but inside that hospital room, the reality was already setting in. A massive void had been created, and nothing, not fame, not money, and not the love of millions could fill it. The big man was gone, and he had taken a piece of the American spirit with him. The world was about to wake up to a headline that didn't feel real. A world in shock. When the news broke on the evening of May 13, 1972, it felt like a glitch in the atmosphere. Television news anchors, usually polished and stoic, stumbled over the words. The headlines across the country all carried variations of the same impossible sentence: Dan Blocker is dead. For a public that had invited him into their homes every Sunday night for over a decade, the news didn't feel like the death of a celebrity. It felt like a death in the family. People didn't just watch Bonanza, they lived it. And in that world, Hoss Cartwright was the moral center, the big-hearted brother who protected everyone. The idea that he could be taken out by a hospital complication felt like a betrayal of the natural order. In Hollywood, the shock was even deeper. The cast and crew of Bonanza were more than co-workers. They were a brotherhood. Lorne Greene, who played the patriarch Ben Cartwright, was devastated. He had looked at Dan as a son in many ways, despite their real-life ages being closer than their characters. Michael Landon, the fiery and talented Little Joe, was hit the hardest. He and Dan were inseparable on set, two sides of a coin who shared a sense of humor and a deep, unspoken bond. When Landon received the call, he reportedly broke down. The studio was paralyzed. Bonanza was still a massive hit, and production for the 14th season was supposed to start soon. The producers faced a choice that no one wanted to make. In those days, when a TV star died, the show usually just replaced the actor, but there was no replacing Dan Blocker. There wasn't another man in Hollywood who possessed that unique mix of physical power and soulful vulnerability. Michael Landon made a brave and unprecedented decision. They wouldn't replace him, and they wouldn't pretend he just went away. They would address the death of Hoss Cartwright on screen. It was the first time in television history that a major show acknowledged the passing of a character due to the real-life death of the actor. The grief extended far beyond the studio lots. Thousands of letters poured in from fans around the globe. Children sent drawings of cowboy hats. Veterans sent medals. Families sent prayers. They all spoke of Dan's kindness. Stories began to surface of his quiet generosity, how he had helped a struggling crew member pay medical bills, or how he had spent hours talking to a lonely fan when the cameras weren't rolling. The Gentle Giant wasn't a PR stunt, it was the truth of who he was. The public was mourning the man as much as the character. As the funeral preparations began, the reality of the loss started to sink in. The Ponderosa ranch, set at Paramount, was eerily quiet. The horses were still there, the costumes were still hanging in the wardrobe department, but the man who filled them was gone. A pall hung over the industry. It was a reminder that even the biggest legends are fragile. The world felt a little colder, little less safe, without that big man in the 10-gallon hat watching over it. The shock eventually turned into a deep, lingering sadness, a collective realization that an era of television had ended in a sterile hospital room, far from the rolling hills of the Nevada territory he had made his own. The cameras eventually started rolling again, but the light had changed. Dan and Dolores. While the world mourned a television icon, a woman named Dolores was mourning her entire world. To the public, he was Hoss, but to her, he was just Dan, the man she had loved since long before the fame and the fortune arrived. Their love story didn't start under the bright lights of a Hollywood studio. It began in the simple, honest hallways of Sul Ross State Teachers College in Alpine, Texas. When they met, Dan wasn't a superstar. He was a massive, ambitious student with a booming laugh and a heart that matched his frame. Dolores saw past the physical size and recognized a man of immense character and intellect. They married in 1952, a time when their future was far from certain. They were young, hopeful, and focused on building a life based on shared values rather than material success. As Dan transitioned from a Korean War hero to a school teacher and eventually to a struggling actor, Dolores was the steady hand on the rudder. She wasn't a typical Hollywood wife who craved the spotlight or the red carpets. She was his anchor, the person who kept him grounded as the Bonanza phenomenon took over their lives. Together, they raised 4 children, Dirk, David, Dana, and Deborah, in a home that prioritized family dinners over industry parties. Dan often credited Dolores for his success, knowing that her strength allowed him to face the grueling demands of his career. She managed the chaos of a household while her husband became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. They were a team in every sense of the word. Despite the enormous wealth that came with being a top-tier TV star, they maintained a sense of normalcy. Now, she was left to navigate a world that still expected her to be the strong woman behind the legend, even though her partner was gone. She had been his silent strength for 2 decades, but now she had to find her own. The long goodbye The aftermath of Dan's death was a heavy, suffocating fog that refused to lift. For Dolores, the house was suddenly too quiet, and the void left by a 6'4" husband was impossible to fill. She didn't just lose a partner, she lost the rhythm of her daily life. The long goodbye wasn't a single event, but a slow, painful process of learning how to breathe in a world that felt fundamentally broken. She had to be both mother and father to 4 children who were also grappling with the loss of a man who seemed invincible. The public's grief, while touching, was also a constant reminder of what she had lost. Everywhere she turned, there was a photo of Dan's smiling face, or a rerun of Bonanza flickering on a screen, keeping the wound perpetually open. As the months turned into years, Dolores became the primary keeper of the Blocker flame. She didn't retreat into bitterness, though she had every right to feel cheated. Instead, she focused on ensuring that her children understood the man behind the myth. She wanted them to remember the teacher and the soldier, not just the cowboy. Her sons, Dirk and David, eventually found their own paths in the industry. Dirk as an actor and David as a producer, carrying on the family name with the same work ethic their father possessed. Dolores watched them grow with a mixture of pride and a lingering ache, seeing glimpses of Dan's kindness and his physical presence in their movements. She remained the North Star for the family, providing the stability that Dan's sudden exit had threatened to destroy forever. The financial legacy Dan left behind through his smart investments and the steakhouse chain provided security, but it couldn't buy peace. Dolores lived a life of quiet dignity, largely avoiding the Hollywood social circuit that had never truly felt like home anyway. She stayed connected to the few true friends they had made, including the Landon and Green families who remained a support system through the darkest chapters. They were all members of a club no one wanted to join, those who had seen the Ponderosa crumble in real time. These bonds were forged in shared sorrow, a collective understanding of what it meant to lose the man who had been the heart of their shared history for 13 years. But time has a way of stretching out when you are waiting to be reunited with your soulmate. For Dolores, the decades following 1972 were a testament to her endurance. She saw grandchildren born who would never feel the grip of Dan's massive hand or hear his booming laugh in person. She told them the stories, painting pictures with words so they would know their grandfather was more than a character on a classic TV channel. She lived through the changing tides of culture, watching as the Western genre faded and the stars of her era slowly passed away, one by one. Through it all, she remained the gentle giant's widow, a title she carried with a grace that was as massive as the man himself. It was a long, lonely road, but she walked it with her head held high, waiting for the day the trail would finally lead her back to him. The years turned into decades, but the memory of May 1972 never truly faded. The final curtain. The passage of time is a strange thing. It can soften the edges of a tragedy, but it never truly fills the hole left behind. For Dolores Blocker, the decades following 1972 were lived in a world that had moved on. Yet she remained anchored by a love that the clock could not touch. As she entered her later years, the Hollywood lights grew dimmer, and the noise of the fame that once surrounded her family faded into a quiet, steady hum. She had successfully steered her 4 children into adulthood, watching them build lives of their own, but the seat beside her remained spiritually occupied by the big man from DeKalb. She had spent more time without him than she had ever spent with him, a mathematical cruelty that many widows understand all too well. In her final years, Dolores moved with a quiet, practiced grace. She didn't seek the spotlight, nor did she run from the fans who still occasionally approached her to talk about how much Hoss had meant to their childhoods. She handled these encounters with the same kindness Dan would have shown, understanding that to the world he was a piece of Americana, but to her, he was the young man she had met in a college hallway in Texas. As her own health began to decline, there was no sense of fear or bitterness. Instead, there was a feeling of a long journey finally nearing its destination. The final curtain wasn't an ending so much as it was the closing of a very long, very lonely chapter. Dolores passed away in 1998, 26 years after the sudden shock of that May morning in California. Her death didn't make the same screaming headlines that Dan's had, but to those who knew the family, it was the closing of an era. She had been the silent guardian of his legacy, the woman who kept the family's feet on the ground while their name was written in the stars. When she drew her last breath, there was a profound sense among her children and friends that she was finally going home, not to a house or a ranch, but to the man she had been waiting for since she was 40 years old. The family chose to bring her back to where it all started. Dan had been buried in the Woodmen Cemetery in DeKalb, Texas, in a plot that was simple and unassuming, far from the glitz of Forest Lawn or the celebrity cemeteries of Los Angeles. He was laid to rest in the red Texas soil he had come from, under a headstone that didn't list his acting credits or his awards. It simply bore his name and the image of a Masonic square and compass, a nod to the fraternity he cherished. When Dolores died, she was placed right beside him. After 26 years of silence, the two were finally side by side again in the quiet shade of the Texas trees. The burial site in DeKalb became a place of pilgrimage for those who still remembered the gentle giant. It is a humble spot, reflecting the reality of the people buried there rather than the characters they portrayed on a screen. There is a deep poetic symmetry in their reunion. They had traveled the world, amassed a fortune, and lived a life that most people only dream of. Yet they ended up exactly where they began, together, in the heart of Texas. The tragic suddenness of 1972 was finally answered by the peaceful permanence of 1998. For the Blocker children, the loss of their mother was the final break from that golden era of the Ponderosa. But it also brought a sense of closure. They had watched her carry the weight of Dan's memory with incredible strength, never wavering in her loyalty or her love. Seeing her laid to rest next to their father was the ultimate tribute to a marriage that had survived the ultimate test of time and distance. The curtain had fallen on their physical lives, but the story they wrote together, one of fame, family, and an unbreakable bond, was finally complete. The giant and his strength were together again, and the Texas wind blew softly over the grass, keeping their secret. The credits finally rolled, but the story was written in stone. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for supporting us.